Okay, so this presentation is going to help you understand a little bit more about tone, what tone is, how to identify it, and some different ways that authors create a specific tone in their works. Okay, so first of all, what is tone? Tone is another word for attitude. And tone can refer to a few different things. It can be the narrator or speaker's attitude towards what's happening. It can be the other character's attitude towards what's happening. Or it can even be the attitude of the author. So it's always somebody's attitude towards the events that are happening in the story. Before you identify the tone of a story, make sure you understand whose tone you're identifying, since it can be different. So for example, the narrator might have a different tone than his best friend in the story. So make sure you understand whose tone it is you're looking at. One thing to clarify is that tone is not about how the story makes you feel. That's mood, and we're going to talk about mood later in this class. So tone has to do with the characters or the author, not you, the audience. So when you identify the tone of a story, you label that tone using adjectives. So the tone might be uplifting, or it might be depressing, or it might be terrifying. Those are all adjectives you could use to describe tone. Sometimes the tone changes throughout the story. So maybe something seems scary, but it ends up having a feeling of relief at the end. When the tone changes, that's called a shift. Or sometimes you might hear us call it a tone shift. Also, and I mentioned this before, but make sure that you're aware that different characters in the story might have different tones. So the protagonist and the antagonist might have very different tones towards what's happening, and therefore they might have different tones. So the antagonist might be happy, but the protagonist is horrified. A lot of the time, tone is complex, and you can't just describe it in one word. So one word is a good starting point, but if the tone is a little bit more nuanced than that, you can use a tone statement like the following examples. I'm not going to read those for you, but you might want to pause the video right now and write those down. And it's important that you never label tone as just positive or negative. You need to be more specific. So positive and negative can be a great starting point. You can say things like, okay, this has a positive tone. But then you need to ask yourself, okay, what makes it positive? Is it positive because it's happy? Is it positive because it's hopeful? Is it positive because it's romantic, etc.? Okay, so the last thing we're going to talk about is some techniques that authors use to create tone. And so they can create tone through their plot of the story, through the characters, the setting, the word choice, or the selection of details. There are other things that authors can do to create tone, but these are the 5 that we're going to focus on. Okay, so first of all, they can use the plot. So what's literally happening in the story, and what tone is created by the events. So in this example, a character who loses his job, breaks up with a girlfriend, and learns his grandmother has cancer, obviously those are all negative events. And so an accumulation of negative events might make a negative tone. But remember, we can't just use the words negative and positive. So you would say, in what ways is that negative? And you might say, the tone of that story is depressed or hopeless. And I apologize if you hear my baby babbling in the background. She's very excited to talk about tone. Authors can also use their characters to convey a certain tone. Remember that tone is a certain character's attitude normally. And so you can look at that specific character to say, what tone does that character have? So some things that you want to look at when you look at characters are, what are they doing, how are they acting, what are they saying, and what are they feeling? Sometimes a character tells you right off, I'm angry. And that's awesome, because now you already know that his tone is angry. That makes identifying tone really easy. But characters don't always tell you how they're feeling. Sometimes you have to infer how they feel based on what they're doing or they're saying. So if our main character from the previous example, the one who lost his job, broke up with his girlfriend, and found out that his grandmother had cancer, if he actually perseveres through all of that and looks for a silver lining in every situation, then his tone might not be depressed like you thought it was before. It might actually be hopeful or forward-thinking. You can also look at the setting, because sometimes authors use a specific setting to convey a certain tone. So setting is where and when the story takes place. So it can be physical location, like it takes place in a city, in the country, in Liberal, in New York. It can be what the weather is like, what season it is, what time of day it is. All of those are different parts of the setting. Different settings can have different tones. So I'm sure you can all picture the classic scary story that starts out, it's a dark and stormy night. That sets a very dark, intimidating kind of tone. So you can look at these different examples to look at how different settings to make different tones. But know that these are just some examples and the possibilities really are endless here. Okay, this one is a big one, word choice and tone. We'll probably do a lot of practice with this specifically because it's a huge way that authors can create tone. So another word for word choice is diction, so you might also hear me say that word diction. So to analyze the diction of a story, the first thing that you want to do is look at specific words and phrases that stick out to you, and then you want to look at the connotation of each word. So connotation, the actual definition of that word is the associations that you have with a word that go beyond the literal meaning. That's kind of a complicated definition. You can think of connotation as what you think of when you think of that word. So if I hear the word, I'm trying to think of an example off the top of my head. If I hear the word home, I might think of a physical house, which would be the literal definition of the word, but I also might think of family and coming together and holidays and spending time together, and I have all these warm and fuzzy kind of associations with that word home. And all of those extra things that I associate with the word, that would be the connotations. So for example, the words wealthy, rich, loaded, and prosperous, they all can mean having a lot of money, but they have really different connotations. For example, if you're loaded, that it's a very slangy word, and you might picture somebody who's very kind of flamboyant and really shows off their money. Whereas like prosperous, you might picture someone really kind of serious and hardworking who's really worked to build up that wealth. With connotation, you can think about which words, like, do these words have positive connotations? Do they have negative connotations? And then you can use that as a starting point again. We don't want to label the tone as positive or negative, but you can say, okay, overall these are all negative, and they're negative because they are sad, or they're negative because they are hopeless, or they're negative because they are angry. And then the last thing we're going to talk about with authors and how they create tone is using selection of detail. So this is where you look at the story and you're going beyond just the plot, but you're looking at specific details that the author gives you. So are there any details that they really emphasize? Is there anything that stands out? And then what tone is created by the details? So here's an example. An author describes a character walking along a crowded city street. But depending on what details are emphasized, it can create a different tone. So does the author emphasize that the street is really loud, that it's smelly because of all the cars, that the character feels like they're being bumped this way and that by other people? Okay, all of those are negative. So you might say this character's tone is overwhelmed or upset. They're not happy. But if it's the same scene, character walking on a crowded street, and the character is talking about how bright and colorful everything is, and he's seeing all these different people, and everything is new, then his tone might not be so negative. Those are all positive experiences. So you might say that he's excited, or he is looking forward to these new experiences. Okay, so I know that was kind of fast. Feel free to go back and watch any sections that you need to. And by the time I see you next in class, you should be able to do the following things. You should be able to define tone and shifts, diction and connotation. You should be able to identify the tone of a story using just one single word or using a tone statement, and make sure that you're using words other than just positive and negative. And finally, you should be able to explain how those 5 things we just talked about affect the tone of a story. So that would be plot, characters, setting, word choice, and selection of details. So if you can't do any of those things, you should go back and watch